ouch was a one-word sentence. Red and square, when used in isolation in the ways lately imagined, are likewise best looked upon as sentences. Most sentences are longer, but even a longer sentence may still be learned as a single unit, like ouch, red, and square, by a direct conditioning of the whole utterance to some sensory stimulation. Characteristically, who mean problems of how we acquire various ideas may often be bypassed by representing the words in question simply as fragments of sentences which were learned as wholes. Not that all or most sentences are learned as wholes. Most sentences are built up rather from learned parts, by analogy with the way in which those parts have previously been seen to occur in other sentences which may or may not have been learned as wholes. It is evident how new sentences may be built from old materials and volunteered on appropriate occasions simply by virtue of the analogies, having been directly conditioned to the appropriate use of foot as a sentence, and hand likewise, and my foot hurts as a whole. The child might conceivably utter my hand hurts on an appropriate occasion, though unaided by previous experience with that actual sentence. But think how little we would be able to say if our learning of sentences were strictly limited to those two modes. The sentences afforded by direct conditioning are such that each has its particular range of admissible occasions, independently of wider context. The sentences added by analogical substitution are more of the same sort. Speech thus confined would be strikingly like bare reporting of sense data. The objective, pull described earlier, would indeed be there. Yet, the effect of this objective, pull by itself, is superficial, a mere warping of the pigeon holes, a gerrymandering in the public interest of the range of stimulations which each report embraces. Our idiom would remain the inadequate, sort of fancifully fanciless medium of unvarnished news. There would be no access to the past. Beyond the negligible yield of an occasional memory trace of an unconceptualized stimulation. What more is needed in order to capitalize the riches of past experience is hinted in the remark that actual memories are mostly traces not of past sensation, but of past conceptualization. We cannot rest with a running conceptualization of the unsullied stream of experience. What we need is a sullying of the stream. Association of sentences is wanted not just with non-verbal stimulation, but with other sentences. If we are to exploit finished conceptualizations and not just repeat them, the most obvious case of the verbal stimulation of verbal response is interrogation. It was already remarked that read as a one-word sentence usually needs a question for its elicitation. The opposite dependence is also common. The power of a non-verbal stimulus to elicit a given sentence commonly depends on earlier associations of sentences with sentences. And in fact, it is cases of this kind that best illustrate how language transcends the confines of essentially phenomenalistic reporting. Thus, someone mixes the contents of two tests, tube observes a green tint and says there was copper in it. Here the sentence is elicited by a non-verbal stimulus. But the stimulus depends for its efficacy upon an earlier network of associations of words with words, namely, one's learning of chemical theory. Here we have a good glimpse of our workaday conceptual scheme as a going concern. Here, as at the crude stage, the sentence is elicited by a non-verbal stimulus. But here, in contrast to that crude stage, the verbal network of an articulate theory has intervened to link the stimulus with the response. The intervening theory is composed of sentences associated with one another. In multifarious ways, not easily reconstructed, even in conjecture. There are so-called logical connections, and there are so-called causal ones. But any such interconnections of sentences must finally be due to the conditioning of sentences as responses to sentences as stimuli. The theory as a whole is a fabric of sentences variously associated to one another and to nonverbal stimuli by the mechanism of conditioned response. Theory causes a sharing by sentences of sensory supports. In an arch, an overhead block is supported immediately by other overhead blocks, and ultimately by all the base blocks collectively and none individually. And so it is with sentences when theoretically fitted. The contact of block to block is the association of sentence to sentence. And the base blocks are sentences conditioned directly to nonverbal stimuli. Perhaps we should think of the arch as tottering on an earthquake. Thus, even a base block is supported now, and again, only by the other base blocks via the arch. Our example, there was copper in it, is an overhead block. One of the base blocks is perhaps the sentence, "The stuff has gone green." A sentence directly conditioned to the sensory stimulation got from the test tube. In the series of sentence-to-sentence associations, ultimately linking the stuff has gone green with "There was copper in it." All steps, but the last, are evidently unspoken. Beneath the uniformity that unites us in communication, there is a chaotic personal diversity of connections. And for each of us, the connections continue to evolve. No two of us learn our language alike, nor, in a sense, does any finish learning it while he lives. At the beginning, we noted the contrast between learning sentences as wholes and building them of parts. As the child progresses, he tends increasingly to build his new sentences from parts. And thus, it is that one usually speaks of learning a new word rather than a new sentence. But even the sophisticated learning of a new word is commonly a matter of learning it in context. Hence, learning by example and analogy the usage of sentences in which the word can occur. It therefore remained appropriate to treat sentences and not words as the wholes whose use is learned. Now, let us think more specifically about the parts. What counts as a word as "against a string of two or more" is less evident than what counts as a sentence. Actually, no rationalization of the word will be needed here. Such is analogy's power to make sense of the insensible. But the fact is that what one learns of molecules by analogy at all is meager. One must see the molecular doctrine at work in physical theory to get a proper notion of molecules. And this is not a matter of analogy nor of description at all. It is a matter of learning the word contextually, as a fragment of sentences which one learns to bring forth as wholes under appropriate circumstances. In the case of some of the terms that refer to physical objects, the value of analogy is more limited still. Thus, in the physics of light, with its notoriously mixed metaphor of wave and particle, the physicist's understanding of what he is talking about must depend almost wholly on context. Such sentences are like cantilever constructions, anchored in what they say of familiar objects at the near end, and supporting the recondite objects at the far end. Explanation becomes oddly reciprocal. Photons are posited to help explain the phenomena. And it is those phenomena and the theory concerning them that explain what the physicist is driving at. One tends to imagine that when someone propounds a theory concerning some sort of objects, our understanding will have two phases. First, we must understand what the objects are, and second, we must understand what the theory says about them. In the case of the wavicles, there is virtually no significant separation. Our coming to understand what the objects are is for the most part just our mastery of what the theory says about them. We do not learn first what to talk about and then what to say about it. Picture 2. Physicists discussing whether neutrinos have mass. Are they discussing the same objects? They agree that the physical theory, which they initially share, needs emendation in the light of an experimental result now confronting them. The one physicist is urging an emendation which involves positing a new category of particles without mass. The other is urging an alternative emendation which involves positing a new category of particles with mass. The fact that both physicists use the except that the descriptive factor is less than in the case of molecule, class, and attribute. Finally, whether or not we grant that they refer to objects will pretty surely be learned in context only.